It's now time to bring you the part two of our interview segment on Business Nigeria. Now, as Nigeria's economic recovery continues to gain a little strength here and there on the back of services and agriculture, with gross domestic product growth reaching 3.6% on a year-on-year basis in the first quarter of this year. The International Monetary Fund has warned that the escalating food prices and insecurity challenges, which have become very ugly features in the Nigerian economy, will cloud the country's economic outlook for this year and even next year. The IMF, in its recent economic and financial development report, maintains that inflation will continue to remain high despite the ongoing economic recovery in the country. Nigeria's inflation rate reached 17.7% just last month, led by a renewed surge in food prices, exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, a development that has continued to see food prices soaring above the purchasing power of the masses. Joining me now live in our Lagos studio as we discuss more on this matter and other issues, I have investment strategist at AfriInvest Asset Management Limited, Temitope Omochi. Thank you very much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, it is clear the impact of the Russia-Ukraine crisis on the current food crisis we are seeing, especially within the food baskets around the globe. But really, we cannot ignore the element of seasonality and an output shocks. Do you think at this point in time Nigeria has any chance whatsoever to cut down on this crisis that we have here, the surge in food prices? Do you think we have any chance at all, going by the current infrastructure development and production levels we have in the country and our dependence on imports?
All right, thank you for having me once again. So it's quite disturbing that we have to begin to talk about seasonality in this generation or at this dispensation, because knowledge, research and development has actually helped to manage seasonality. A country that has developed would not be bothered about seasonality because they are predictable. You know that this is peak period and these are off-peak period. So peak period, you are able to, get some inventory, stock, so that off-peak period you have excess and that moderate prices. So I think the challenge has to do with the fact that we've depended a lot on, importation. And, the situation is now worse than ever due to what we've seen in recent times, in recent times globally and domestically. So when you look at it from the global front, what comes to mind is the recent crisis between Russia and Ukraine. But it has even started even way beyond even COVID-19 and even 2016 when we saw economic recession. Before I even go into that, food security, I think if we understand what it means, that will help us have a very good, picture of what it means to achieve food security. I like the fact that, the IMF said the food security, insecurity will worsen, not that there's no existential food insecurity. Way back 10 years ago, there has been, heightened food insecurity in Nigeria, because when you talk about food security, it has to do with everybody having access, like all Nigerians having access to food supply at all times in sufficient quantity. And the access has to be economic access and physical access. So when you look at it in that, within this, the concept I've just mentioned, you must have both physical access and economic asset in terms of purchasing power. So in a situation where there's even abundant food supply and purchasing power is low as a result of unemployment, low income, inflation, there's also a problem of food insecurity. And in addition to the definition, one should also look at the fact that the food must be sufficient, safe and be nutritious to keep people, healthy and active. So food insecurity is, it has been a phenomenon in Nigeria for quite a while now. But I think this problem has actually accentuated, the Russia-Ukraine crisis has accentuated the problem. The reasons are not far-fetched. Russia is the #1 fertilizer producer in the world. You know that these two nations, Russia and Ukraine, account for close to 30% of wheat supply. And we've also seen a series of responses by countries. Over 20 countries have banned the export of, one agri-produce or the other. We saw that recently India banned the export of wheat. We saw Indonesia, oil palm. We saw Egypt as well, wheat, despite the fact that they depend on, Russia and Ukraine for wheat, consumption. So countries are deliberately, banning export of, of food because they want to ensure that domestic food security is achieved. So for Nigeria, because we've relied heavily on, importation. And it's evidence if we check the numbers, the foreign trade statistics numbers. In fact, in 2021 alone, compared to 2020, food imports rose by over 50%. And this year alone, if you go by the recent number for Q1, right, and you extrapolate it, we are looking at over, 50% this year as well. And it's about 2.6 trillion naira for just food importation alone. So I think it's high time we began to look at this, because the world economy is moving from what we call globalization to deglobalization. Countries are now, a number of leaders have learned a great lesson in 2019 and 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Exactly.
You will observe that a number of developed countries, they prioritize their citizens in terms of COVID-19 vaccine supply, in terms of so many other things. So countries are now more of the autarky, just focus on your country, your citizen, than concerns about what is happening in other countries. So the time is now for Nigeria to begin to feed its people and to not rely heavily on other countries, because everybody is more of nationalistic now, deglobalization, than the openness to trade.
And talking about this whole agenda of being able to feed your people, like you've also mentioned, to contextualize how this Russia-Ukraine crisis is also affecting Africa and Nigeria, we look at the prices of fertilizer going up about 300%, wheat also escalating about 45% since the war in Ukraine started. And then we have interventions like that of the AFDB also bringing to bear $1.5 billion to ensure that we have some shore up in production of wheat, maize, and other commodities. At the end of the day, we keep on asking ourselves, like you've also said, at home here, how do we begin to rate the performance of interventions like that of the CBN to ensure that we have agriculture production levels higher than what we currently have, surpassing the infrastructural challenges that we have as we speak right now? Implementation is the missing element. We have these fantastic blueprints, but the challenge is that what we have on paper, or the investment volume on paper, does not translate to the output. How do we change this narrative? Irrespective of the insecurity challenges we have here, there are still safer food hubs that we could develop here.
Yeah, so we've seen a series of interventions, like you've mentioned, and the recent support, put forward by the African Development Bank and a number of other agencies, they are quite good. But we all know that, the problems in the agricultural sector is far beyond, just intervention policies. In fact, from the oil boom of 1970, when the trajectory of the Nigerian economy, the structure of the economy changed from, agriculture as the mainstream to, oil. We've seen series of, national developmental plans, Operation Feed the Nation, a number of those. So Nigeria is not devoid of policies, plans, beautiful programs, intervention and support. In fact, recently, within the last, few years, we've seen a lot of support from the central bank, from banning of, 41 items, having access to FX, alcohol borrowing schemes, a number of those. So I think the problem is not just about, programs and funding. I think it has to do with, like you said, implementation. Are we ready to follow through with the plans, around? We have a number of them. Are we committed? Our Nigerian leaders also committed to ensuring that, these policies and programs are implemented to the later. And again, you have to look at insecurity. No country in the world can thrive amidst insecurity. A number of farmers, in maybe 2020, 2019, or 2015, they've left their farms as a result of, before now we're talking about just farmer-header clashes. That was the talk of 2016, 17, and flooding in the Middle Belt region. But now we talk about heightened insecurity across the nation. We talk about Boko Haram and a lot of other, factors adding to the existential infrastructure problem that is, electricity, road, and all of that. In fact, if you want to jumpstart or you want to grow your sector, agricultural sector at an exponential rate, you have to look at infrastructure. Energy is also at the epicenter of infrastructure. Now we are talking about increase in energy prices. So that would, in a way, even hamper, whatever we want to do in the agricultural space. So I think on the front burner has to be insecurity, addressing insecurity, and there has to be punitive measures. There has to be punitive measures to, government officials that are not, acting to the letter, policies and plans that have gotten government monetary support. But in a society where there's no punishment, in a society where there's no accountability, in a society where there's no evaluation and feedback on policies, nothing would happen. The next beautiful policy that we'll see tomorrow will also hit a snag. No matter how beautiful the policies are, nothing will change except we address implementation, evaluation, feedback, and there's punishment, for lack of transparency.
Okay, now to interpret, wrapping up the conversation, let's also have your forecast for food inflation for this month. We are looking at last month's figures, 19.5%. This was an 8-month high. Now, what's your next forecast? Do you think we're going to see a sharper spike, or to what extent do you also see state actors now at state government levels taking these figures much more seriously and then investing a little bit more in the areas of comparative advantages, talking about states that are relatively safer?
So, well, outlook for, in fact, inflation generally from food inflation that is currently, above 19%. You could easily, because if you look at the month-on-month, increase is about 2%. So even at 1.6%, 1.5%, you should expect about 20%, food inflation for this month. And in fact, this year you shouldn't even look at, about 17, 18% because inflation will remain highly elevated. And the reasons are not far-fetched. If you look at imported food inflation, it's at its record high since 2017 when we saw exchange rate at 4.95, the peak of, after the economic recession, that was the peak of exchange rate. And now, there's no respite in sight when you look at what is happening to exchange rate. So the outlook is actually very, very scary. And, but I think once the outlook is known and the problems are known, I think all we need to do is to be bold enough, to ensure that all of these doom forecasts are not,
don't become a reality.
Yes, don't become a reality and they don't come to fruition. So, and we've talked about one of the approaches, government should begin, state government have competitive and cooperative advantage in terms of production of, certain products that we import. Some of them are wheat, talk about maize, and this, these items account, in fact, rice, they account for over 30% of the, consumption expenditure. If you look at the NBS consumption expenditure, basket. So I think it's better addressed now due to the fact that the situation is getting worse. Because look at 2019, it's just about, in terms of expenditure on food, it's about 56%. At that point, food inflation was just 30%, right? And now food inflation is 90%. That means you should expect an average Nigerian to spend about 70, 80, or 90% on food. And there's this concept in economics that any nation that spends a lot on consumption, the lower the welfare of that nation, because you won't have enough to spend on health, education, and other things. So I think it's high time we addressed it, before it degenerates into other problems, social vices, and a number of, socio-economic problems.
And I think these figures are enough for government to see. We have about 40% of the population falling well below the poverty line. Another expected 50 million Nigerians expected to also drop into this category. It's quite a difficult situation, but at the end of the day, this is a heavy political season. We'll wait for the next administration to come into bear and then kickstart, because at this point in time, there's little that can change for now until next year. Thank you so much for your time on the show this afternoon, Temitope Moshui, and then we hope government takes necessary actions to ensure we have a better state of affairs. Thank you once again.
You're welcome.